Hello everyone, welcome back to Super's class on Mario Kart DS game mechanics. Today I'm going to talk about walls and how to not touch them. First, let's look at what walls are. Obviously there are walls that look like walls, but the game handles collisions separate from the visible track model. So what you see aren't really walls, but they are made to line up nicely with the real walls. There are also various objects that can act like walls, such as some trees, but I'm not going to talk about these since the game uses different logic for detecting when you touch them. The walls I will be talking about here are walls in the course's .kcl file. The KCL file defines floors, walls, and out-of-bounds areas, and it defines all of these as triangles. Every wall in the game is a triangle, although they are often paired together to make a combined rectangle shape. Whether a triangle is a floor, wall, or something else depends only on what the developers decided to call it. Most of what I say about these triangles will also apply to floors and out-of-bounds triangles too, although I am of course focused on walls. Okay, so all walls are triangles, but what shape is your cart? Let's take a look. Egg 1 is a sphere. Standard carts are also spheres. Cucumber, also sphere. LGS, sphere again. All carts are spheres. The only thing that changes is their size. Okay, so now that we know what shape everything is, let's look at how to not touch walls. There are 6 ways to not touch walls in Mario Kart DS. The first way is the boring way. Don't get too close. If your hitbox does not overlap with the triangle, you won't touch the wall. On many tracks, this is the only method most players will use, although it is not the only one used in tool-assisted speedruns. The second way, and the only other way frequently used by players, makes use of what are called edge walls. This is a special type of wall that's used when the wall is directly under a floor's edge. A good example of this is Shroom Ridge. The cliff walls are, well, walls, and they rise up to the same elevation as the floor. But you can drive over the edge without hitting them because the game will not let you touch both a floor and an edge wall at the same time. Now, this isn't as simple as you can't touch edge walls if you are also touching a floor. No, the game determines which one you're allowed to touch based on whether you are closer to the edge vertically or horizontally. So if you drive out far enough on the edge, you will start touching the wall and start not touching the floor, even though your hitbox still overlaps the floor a bit. To see what it would be like without this special property of edge walls, you can drive here on Tick-Tock Clock, where this wall is mistakenly not an edge wall. You can get kinda stuck on the edge as your cart repeatedly collides with both the wall and floor at the same time. The wall keeps you from driving fully onto the floor, and the floor keeps you from falling fully off. Although this behavior can save you from falling off a cliff, it is flawed. If you try to drive over a corner like this, then whether you hit the wall depends on your frame spacing, the exact position of your cart on a particular frame. If you are lucky, then the wall being an edge saves you and you drive over the corner no problem. If you are unlucky, you will hit the wall even if you drive over the corner only a very little. There's one other interesting flaw with edge walls that can happen as a result of Nintendo messing up the walls while making GBA Bowser Castle 2. They did intend for you to be able to drive up on the top of the walls, so there are edge walls here. The problem is that the edge walls extend all the way down instead of the lower portion being just regular wall triangles. This makes this possible. The third way to not touch a wall is to not move, which seems odd because how can you move your hitbox to overlap with a wall without moving? And the answer is, get pushed by a triangle. When you drive on a slope, you slide downward slowly, until you stop. The downward slide comes from the floor pushing you back up at an angle each frame, but Nintendo decided that if you aren't moving, you shouldn't slide. So triangles cannot push you if you aren't moving, and you can stop right as the floor pushes you slightly into a wall. The fourth way of not touching a wall is to be behind the wall. Anytime you are behind a wall, the game will not let you touch it. This is likely to prevent glitchy double-sided walls, such as this fence in Delfino Square. Your hitbox can easily be overlapping the triangles on both sides, but only the one you are in front of will be touched. This requires a little more explanation. For one, when I say behind the wall, I mean that the center of the cart's hitbox is behind the wall. Obviously, when the hitbox overlaps the triangle, it isn't entirely behind the wall, but the game only cares about the center of the hitbox here. Second, there are actually two hitbox locations. There's the obvious one that represents where your hitbox is now, and then there's the one that represents where your hitbox was before this frame's regular movement. It is this second one that must be behind the wall. This means that it is impossible to drive through a wall simply by being fast enough to move from in front to behind in a single frame. Okay, but what is regular movement? By this, I essentially mean all movement except respawn warps, pushes from triangle collisions, and hitbox rotation. Wait, hitbox rotation? But hitboxes are spherical. What does rotating the hitbox do? Well, the hitbox does not rotate around its center. Instead, it rotates around a point at the bottom of the cart, which is slightly outside the hitbox. So rotating it moves the center point. We can see the effect of this by getting very close to the wall, facing into the wall, and jumping. Jumping will temporarily rotate the hitbox backwards, at which point it will be in front of the wall, and so you now touch it. We'll see later a way to use this to get behind a wall. Before moving on to the other two ways to not touch walls, I'd like to make an honorable mention for the Delfino Square fountain. If you get pushed in just the right way by another racer, it is possible to go through the wall here. However, this is not a result of not touching the wall. It does get touched in this video clip. The reason it is possible to go through is actually that there's a third wall behind the ones that are meant to be accessible. The push from this wall can counteract the push from this other wall, leading to your hitbox being behind the wall after all collision has happened. The fifth way of not touching a wall is related to the fourth. If you drive out from the wall, chances are you will drive through the backside of it without touching the wall. This is the 820 rule. To understand this, let's look at a two-dimensional view of the triangle from the side. From the side, the triangle looks like a line. Your hitbox looks like a circle, and I've filled in a small circle to represent the center of the hitbox. The wall faces right, so the hitbox is currently behind the wall and not touching it. Now let's drive out from the wall. If we drive very slowly, then on the frame after the cart moves in front of the wall, it will touch the wall. This is because it was not behind the wall before this frame's movement. But if we drive faster, the cart does not touch the wall. Here's the cart's position before and after movement. For the 820 rule, we want to look at the distance between these positions, but only consider the distance that is along a line perpendicular to the triangle. That's why the side 2D view is useful. We can easily see distance along that line. If this distance is at least 820 subunits, then the cart will not touch the wall. This isn't generally very useful, but it is commonly used in tool-assisted speedruns to go around corners slightly tighter. For some context on how big 820 subunits is, here's a representation of the smallest hitbox in the game, Egg. This hitbox is 13 units in diameter. Each unit is 4,096 subunits. Here's a sphere with diameter 820 subunits placed in the same location. It's tiny. Okay, before we look at the last way to not touch walls, I want to take a moment to talk about how hitbox rotation can put you behind a wall and how the 820 rule is used. This is possible at 90-degree corners if you get bumped by another racer just right. For now, let's ignore this wall since I'm using the sixth method of not touching walls for that. We'll get to that in a bit. For now, just know that we can't be behind this wall, so the 820 rule is used here. Next is hitbox rotation. Remember that the cart's hitbox rotates around the bottom of the cart, and that this motion is not checked for collision. This rotation can be more than 820 subunits in one frame, putting me behind the wall. And this is where getting bumped is important, because hitbox rotation can only go so far. Remember that I am moving 820 plus subunits out from the wall each frame. Continuing like this would bring me back in front before I can land. The bounce from the other racer adds some extra momentum, keeping me behind the wall. Note that the 820 rule itself is irrelevant at this point since I'm behind the wall. This way of getting behind walls isn't really useful, largely because it requires specific movement by a second player. But let's look at how I went through that first wall now, the last way of not touching a wall. And let's take a look at it with this Mario Circuit shortcut. Here you can see Yoshi is inside the wall, but is not touching it. Oh, and he's also inside the floor using the 820 rule. Now, you might think, oh, the game just hasn't rendered collision with the wall yet. But no, if we go forward a couple frames, Yoshi never touches the wall. And if you go frame by frame at a regular wall collision, the game never renders the cart partially inside a wall. You might also think, oh, the triangles aren't properly aligned with the visual model here. Again, no, I can show them here, and you can see that they do line up correctly. So what is happening here? This is an example of going through a wall's edge. To understand going through wall edges, let's take a look at the cart's hitbox and the wall triangle in 2D. Here's a side view like before, and a front-facing view on the left. Here's the cart's current hitbox location, and here's the second hitbox location, the one before moving. This location is in front of the triangle, so the behind the wall rule doesn't apply. Notice that the center of the hitbox in both places is outside the bounds of the two-dimensional triangle. This by itself isn't enough to not touch the wall, but when this is the case, the game does care if the current hitbox location is behind the wall. If it is, then you will not touch the wall. So this requires three things. 1. Location before movement is outside the 2D triangle. 2. Location after movement is outside the 2D triangle. And 3. Location after movement is behind the triangle. There's another well-known shortcut where you go through the edge of a wall, the Rainbow Road Spiral Skip. There's a wall under this road that extends past the edges of the visible road. There are also some out-of-bounds triangles to the left, and they are close enough that you will almost certainly go through one of the triangle's edges when you do the shortcut. And that's all of the ways to not touch a wall in Mario Kart DS. What's that you say? I didn't explain this shortcut in Donut Plains? Yes, I did. It's the last one, going through triangle edges. Okay, yeah, this warrants a little more explanation. Remember that all walls are triangles. Rectangular walls are actually two triangles in a trench coat. Of course, the trianguliness of rectangular walls doesn't matter in most cases. After all, if you have a rectangle made of two triangles that share a side, then you cannot be outside both 2D triangles at once while being inside the 2D rectangle. Lucky for us, some wall triangles are not positioned exactly where they should be. On some walls, these two edges are not in exactly the same place. In some cases, the triangles overlap. This is not useful. In other cases, there is a small gap between the triangles. If you can get both hitbox locations to be inside this gap, and also get the current hitbox location behind the triangles, then you can fly straight through the rectangle. These gaps exist between rectangles and irregularly shaped walls too. These gaps come in a variety of sizes, but almost all of them are smaller than 820 subunits, and the vast majority are much smaller. Now that might make it seem like going through a gap is absurdly difficult. And yeah, for most gaps it is. But there is one gap that is actually pretty easy aside from one frame-perfect jump. If you'd like to go through a rectangle yourself, I have a tutorial video for how to do it at this wall. Once you get through, you can drive all the way out to the skybox. I've linked to that in the description, so check it out if that sounds fun. Either way, thanks for watching.